Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on risk, resiliency, and academic outcomes for minoritized youth. Your presenters today are Alyson, Funn, and Alesha Hill. Before I introduce your presenters for today, I just want to go over a few key reminders. We will have the presentation go up until about 2:45, 2:50. We will have a Q&A session about 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the hour. So if you have a question or a comment you would like to submit for the Q&A, please feel free to drop that in the chat box. Please remember to mute your sound throughout the whole webinar. And if you're comfortable, please feel free to turn on your video or not. Do whatever makes you feel comfortable. As I mentioned, your presenters today are Alyson, Funn, and Alesha Hill. Alyson is a doctoral student in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Utah. Alyson currently works at the UTTEC lab on the well-being team with Summit County and is a team lead with the Integrative School Support Team project in collaboration with Career Path High School. Alesha is also a graduate student in the school psychology doctoral program at the University of Utah. Alesha currently works at the University of Utah Huntsman Mental Health Institute in the Autism Spectrum Disorder Clinic and Neurobehavioral Home Program. Welcome, Alyson and Alesha. We are super excited to have you here today. I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Annie. Okay, so our talk today is risk, resiliency, and academic outcomes for minority youth. So Annie did a wonderful job introducing us, but I am Alesha, and I am in the University of Utah doctoral program for school psychology. My research interests are mental health, risk, resiliency, lifetime outcomes, and access.
And I'm Alyson. I'm a second-year doctoral student in school psychology, and my researching interests are pretty in line with Alesha, looking at marginalized youth, mental health, achievement disparities, and trauma. So we're really excited to be here with you today and share something that we feel so passionately about.
Definitely. So our goal is to inform, educate, and provide equitable solutions and solve problems. No small task.
In full disclosure, as we started to go through this as well, we were like, okay, this is what we want to do, talking about trauma. And what we noticed it quickly came to was talking about ACEs. And so we'll talk a lot about that today, but the core of all of that is really focusing on minority youth and some of those different underpinnings and how it really impacts our students and then how we can help. And so I'll just keep going. The introduction part here is really just that component is we feel really passionately about trauma. When we start to look at the statistics in here, you're going to understand why, because so many of the students that we are encountering, one form or another, they have experienced. And as educators, as parents, as human beings, those are going to come out in different ways. And so for us, we wanted to bring more awareness, as we had mentioned, and then talk about the different ways that we can help educators, we can help each other try and solve this problem. And so we wanted to start out with this quote right here, because I think it really just underscores and highlights why we chose this topic. And when we start to look at trauma, at the basis of this, we have these adverse childhood experiences. And so Dr. Robert Block said, hey, these adverse childhood experiences are like the single greatest unaddressed public policy or public health that's threatening our youth today. And so if they are going unchanged, unfixed, unhelped, then there's a lot of different challenges that stem from that. And so the problem, as we started to look at statistics, first of all, what is happening? Like, how many students is this really impacting? Like, how many children is this really are really faced with this? And so as we started to go through the statistics, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the numbers were pretty alarming as we started to pull through all of the reports. And so what this is this is 618,000 students, individuals, children, insert, but it's children that are victims of child abuse and neglect. And we wanted to focus on that minority component. We'll talk about this study a little bit later, but just saying like, hey, the demographic that was used for this study, and then when we think about minority youth, and right here, American Indian or Alaskan Natives are going to be the highest. They have the highest victimization rates. And then African Americans have the second highest victimization rates. And so if we're understanding who's in our classroom and who we're contending with every day, we can start to say, oh gosh, okay, this is what's happening. And so if we break down those statistics just a little bit more. So what this breaks down to is 8.4 victims out of 1,000 children in the population. One is too many, but 8.4 in total. So then we start to look at the disparities between gender. And so for girls, it's going to be 8.9%. And for boys, it's going to be 7.9% for every 1,000 students, individuals, children. For the victimization rate for those American Indian or Alaskan Native, as I had mentioned, is 15.5, and African American is 13.2. So we can say already, like, holy cow, okay, there's something really going on here that is challenging for our children. So when we say, hey, Alyson, you mentioned these numbers, where are they coming from? How do you know this? And so what happened is we looked at this report. It was Child Protective Services agencies that were reporting on this. And so what they said is there was 3.9 million, that's a rounded number, but they said there were 3.9 total referrals. So you and I, as educators, we're calling in, we're saying, hey, we're worried about Bobby. Like, what's happening with Bobby? We're calling CPS. And so they said 3.9 million is what they had. Total referrals for maltreatment on students. And it includes approximately 7.1 million children, which is wild. So when we go a little bit further in this, we talk about screened in referrals, which are the referrals that are actually going to be receiving help. And there are referrals that are going to be screened out. That they're maybe for one reason or another, they're not going to follow up with and investigate. And so when we think about it, the screened in referrals, it's 28.9%. And so we're thinking like a little bit more than every 1 in 4 phone call that comes in, CPS is going to be following up with for the children. So this comes from 47 states that were reporting, and 54.2% of the total referrals were screened in, and 45.8% of the referrals were screened out. Okay, so what are you talking about? You talked about these numbers, you said, hey, CPS, this is what maltreatment, what does that even mean? And so each state is going to have its own definition of what maltreatment looks like. And so if we look at this definition right here, it's saying, hey, it's a failure to act on the part of a parent or a caretaker. And while they each have their own definition, each individual state has their own definition, there's a minimum of what a qualifying standard is for this one. And so we're saying, hey, any death, serious physical harm, emotional harm, sexual abuse, exploitation, that is what we're talking about when we're talking about maltreatment, and we're talking about these numbers in here. And so that's a lot of trauma that's happening. And more numbers. As somebody that loves numbers, I love to start out with these because I think it sets the stage. Like, you and I can talk about it every day. When we talk about numbers too, I think sometimes we get a little bit lost. I get lost, I'll say that. And just saying, hey, here's a statistic, here's a number. When we actually look at the students in front of us, that's when it becomes more real to us. So right here I can say, hey, 76.1 of the referrals that came in were for neglect. 16.5 were coming in for physical abuse. The way that I like to look at it is I say, hey, okay, this is the overall statistic. And then I think about the students that are in my classroom, the students that I'm engaging with, and what that actually turns out to be. And so that's when I'm like, okay, I take this big number and it starts to paint a picture and say, wow, okay, that's a lot of students in my school that are going through this. This is a lot of students that I need to be more informed to be able to help and to be able to alleviate some of those challenges that they're going through. And so that's why I like to set the stage with some of these numbers. And I know they're not happy numbers, but I think that really it's just underscoring the challenge that we have right here. And so sex trafficking, any of these numbers are going to be hard for us to look at. And so I also want to pay mind and pay attention to that as well, that some of these topics that we are going to talk about today are going to be really hard. And so feel free to pause, take a break, take a time out if you need to as well. But we sure appreciate you being here with us and talking about this very important topic. Okay, So as I mentioned, you, me, we're doing reporting. So when we talk about doing reporting, 66.7% of the reports that are coming in are from professionals. So what does professional mean? Could mean anything. But in this context, what we're going to say is it is, a person that is legal or law enforcement, and that could be a police officer, an SRO, anyone that kind of has that law title, and that is going to be inclusive of 20.9% of this professional right here. For you and I, educational personnel was 17.2, and medical personnel was 11.6. Now, if I'm going to say nerd in the most affectionate way, because I totally love data. So if you are reading this report and you're going through and looking at the statistics and you nerd out on the data, what you are going to see too is you're going to see a decline. The last time that these numbers were pulled were in 2020. That's when we're reporting from. And so in that year, you saw a decline. And if we look at this right here, it's going to be pretty easy to understand why. Because when we think about the pandemic, our students weren't in schools. And so if we look at this right here and see what students were, they were being missed potentially because they weren't coming into schools. So that's why you'll see a decline in the report if you check it out. Okay, so I promise this is the last statistic slide, at least for just a little bit. But I also want to underscore this too, because as we're talking about this, as we're drawing attention to it, we're saying, okay, this is what we're seeing in the classroom. This is potentially what I need to be looking out for. And then also the perpetrator side of this. I think sometimes in my head, I'm like, oh, it's the parent. And that's not fair. But that statistic right here, when we're looking at it, we're saying, okay, this statistic over here, 77.2% did come from the parent. 47.1 were male. And when we looked at the disparity between the male and female, I was actually surprised that female were more. And maybe that's just me being naive, but that's just another thing in the back of my head that I'm like, okay, I have this going on. This is something I need to be aware of. Another statistic in here is just saying that 82.3% of the individuals that were, exhibiting harm, demonstrating harm, exhibiting harm on their children were between, or their friend, caregiver, whoever, were between 18 and 44. Okay, so if I didn't completely put you to sleep, here is the interactive portion of this.
Okay, so we thought this is a really big topic, and with individuals coming from all sorts of different backgrounds, it would be nice to just kind of pull everybody together and think about what are the things that all of us think about when we're thinking about adverse childhood experiences or childhood trauma. So we wanted to do a little word cloud. You can text to 22333, and you'll just want to text Alesha Hill 408. That will enter you into the word cloud, and then you can text all the words you want. So that is open right now. We'll take a minute to let people add in what they're thinking about. And then we'll just display this and kind of just get, that a general feel of where people's heads are at on this topic. So
We promise it's not spam either.
no, it's been tried and tested.
Yes. When she told me to text it, I was like, are you sure? Are you positive? But we just appreciate hearing your all's experiences too, because where we work and who we engage with too may be different, and so we just appreciate the chance to collaborate with everyone.
Absolutely, and we have responses coming in. Thanks so much. This is awesome. Okay, I'll give it just a few more seconds here. Oh, there's so many coming in. Very cool.
We get to cheat and see what they are ahead of
Yes.
time. We promise we'll show you in just a second.
It'll be a big reveal. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this now. Okay, and then I'm going to display this for all of you guys. One sec here. This is a new endeavor. Very fun. And Okay. So this is what everybody came up with here. And there's so many powerful words in here. I'm sure you guys are probably pretty used to word clouds at this point. So knowing that those larger texts are more people adding those same words. So physical abuse is a big association for all of us when it comes to adverse childhood experiences. I see also mental illness coming up. We have substance abuse. We have hunger, which is interesting, and domestic violence. So talking about some of those home factors, some of those more environmental, social factors coming into place. So there's so many things that contribute to these adverse childhood experiences, and I think that it's really reflecting here. So that's awesome. Thank you, everybody, for participating in that. Okay, so talking more about these adverse childhood experiences. So kind of a landmark study that I'm sure probably everybody has heard of is the ACEs study. This is originally done at Kaiser Permanente from 1995 to 1997. And it's still one of the most used screeners for adverse childhood experiences today. So this study, it was a collaborative effort between the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Kaiser Permanente. This was examining relationships among 10 childhood stressors and a variety of health and social problems. It's demonstrated how abuse, neglect, and witnessing domestic violence and childhood exposure to household dysfunctions are actually common and highly interrelated. So this is a big turning point, I think, just in the medical field in general. This is coming about in a time when we're starting to think more about environmental factors, more about individuals holistically, versus kind of just treating psychopathologies and lifetime outcomes as if they were in a vacuum. And I think this is a really important shift that we've taken. So talking a little bit more about this study, there were 17,000 health maintenance organization members. This took place in Southern California. They did physical exams and completed confidential surveys regarding their childhood experiences and current health status and behaviors. So it was a nice place to be able to do it through a health system, because we actually have all of this information on all of their past health, current health, and we could just look at those as indicators in terms of what's happening with these relationships. So some of the things that were found were that 87% reported at least one additional ACE category. We have a really high prevalence in terms of parental discord. We found 23.3%. Substance abuse was at 26.9%. At least one incarcerated family member was at 4.7%. And prevalence of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse was really high in just all of those sections.
So Alesha started to touch on already some of the major findings that came out of this study. And it's pretty powerful being able to collect so much data. And we kind of referenced before the demographic that was used, the 17,000 participants were Caucasian individuals. And so for us, as we started to look at that, we were like, holy cow, okay, if this was a Caucasian demographic, that was just us saying like, okay, we tend to attribute more opportunity or more affluence or more some of these factors. And so when we think about our minority youth and some of the disparaging challenges that they contend with, we were pretty alarmed with this. And so to continue with some of these major findings, here's some additional ones.
Yeah, so ACEs are common across all populations. Almost 2/3 of study participants are reporting at least one ACE, like I mentioned, but more than 1 in 5 reported 3 or more ACEs. So we definitely are seeing that some populations are more vulnerable to experiencing ACEs, and this is because of social and economic conditions in which, you know, they're living, where their, you know, parents are working, where their homes are, where they're going to school, the neighborhoods they're playing in. So to break down what the ACEs form looks like a little bit more, it's just a total score across the different categories of ACEs reported by participants. So for this original study, there's a 10-item scale, and they did find that there is a graded dose response relationship between ACEs and negative health and well-being outcomes. So what we're trying to say is there is a cumulative effect here with the more ACEs being reported, the higher likelihood we're seeing adverse outcomes later in life.
So it may be obvious at this point by now, as we started to talk about this data, we talked about different traumas and some of the experience that our students and children are contending with. And so adverse childhood experiences, these are things that are potentially traumatic that are happening in childhood. And so when we think about childhood and we think about childhood development, both 0 to 17 years, having these types of really big traumatic experiences are going to have a big impact on development and for children. And so we are, whether that means, you know, increased suicidal ideation, whether that means substance abuse, we will talk about some of those in just a bit. But this is just saying, hey, here are the statistics. This is what's happening. This is what's happening in the classrooms. These are the students that I'm contending with. This are some of the studies and why this is so important and how this came about. And then now starting to look at some of those developmental factors and saying, hey, if these traumatic things are happening, what are the implications that are going to have on development? How is that going to demonstrate? What is that going to look like as we progress into adulthood? And for us as educators, what does that look like in the classroom? And what should I look for? And then how do I help? Because this is like a big conversation. We already know 618,000 children are being impacted by some form of trauma or maltreatment. And so that's quite a bit. So when we break down the ACEs and talk about them a little bit more, and so that's what the ACEs acronym is, not to be, you know, presumptive that everyone knows, but that's just adverse childhood experiences. That's that acronym that we keep throwing around. And so what are they? The 3 big ones are going to be abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And so over here you can see the different this is how we kind of broke them down, is just like this. So abuse can include physical abuse, it can include emotional abuse, sexual abuse. Neglect can be physical or emotional. Household dysfunction, if you have a mother in the house that was treated violently, whether they were physically abused, whether you saw them being pinned up, whether you saw them just some of those different challenging things in there. If you had anyone in the home that was experiencing severe mental illness or attempted suicide, anyone that was using substances, or you had an incarcerated a relative, or your parents were divorced or separated. And I think we go into these a bit more in talking about some of them. But as I kind of mentioned before, the childhood years from the prenatal period to late adolescence are going to be those building block years, and they set the stage. And so if we literally think about little blocks as we're starting to build them, and if I have a block over here that's cracked, and then if I stack another block on top of it and it's really heavy, what's going to happen to that foundation? I'm going to just keep stacking things on top of there that are really challenging, and then potentially that foundation is going to crumble. I just use that because I'm very much a visual person and thinking about the building blocks. So while we have some degree of stress that's going to be normal in childhood, these are the things that they're going to stick out, that are going to make those cracks in those blocks as the students, as the children are setting the foundation for their adulthood, for their lifespan. And so any kind of like prolonged adversity, especially in your and not having any protective factors, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well, the evidence says, the research says that, hey, a lot of toxic stress that happens in childhood can be really harmful for our students. And so whether that means it is like impacting their immune system or their nervous system, and it can also alter your DNA, which is absolutely wild to think about. And thinking about like intergenerational trauma, and thinking about how trauma can be passed on from generation to generation. And so it's kind of nutty when you think about all these different things and just like how pervasive trauma is in childhood. And all of these changes, they can also impact and create changes in the brain as well. And so that's why we thought this was pretty important.
Definitely. So we want to take a little bit closer look at that initial survey. Alyson did a really good job of looking at all the different areas that we're trying to target when we're using this screener. And so now we're just going to look at it a little bit more. And so just as an activity, as I go through these items with you, I'm going to go through them kind of slowly, so give you a second to just kind of think about them for yourself. And I invite you to kind of just take a personal inventory to yourself in terms of what is your own ACEs score, so that you can have a frame of reference for thinking about how this is all panning out in different individuals and in different environments. So here are our items, and so I'm just going to read through them slowly, like I said. And so if you want to join in and kind of calculate for yourself, it's just a yes for an item would be 1 point, and a no would be a 0. So it's very straightforward. Okay, so first we have, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? So that's a lot of different things kind of coming together in one item. Okay, item 2. Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? So really going into that physical abuse piece. Next, we have, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt to actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Clearly addressing the sexual abuse piece here. Next, we have, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you, or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? So we're addressing some of those emotional needs here, and just feeling secure and supported. And next we have, were your parents ever separated or divorced? So that kind of splintering in the household, which is contributing to instability. Next we have, was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes, often, or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes, or threatened with a gun or knife? So looking at that violence piece again, now we're looking at violence not directed towards the child, but directed at a very important caregiver, and also, this is the home environment. So we have kind of a lot of things going on in this item. Next we have, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic, or who used street drugs? This is another item that kicks on a lot of levels in terms of chaos in the home, in terms of security, in terms of parents and caregivers being able to provide emotional support, help with that emotional development. Next we have, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? And again, we're kind of addressing those same items just in another way, which is stability in the home, support, being, emotionally cared for. And last is, did a household member go to prison? So I hope that you were able to take a moment and kind of think about, what your ACEs score would be. And these are heavy items. So I think it was important to kind of go through and see what are the things that we're actually specifically asking about. Because they're very critical, they're very powerful items. I find them actually hard to read myself. And so when you're thinking about a child who, has 3 ACEs scores or 4 ACEs scores or 5 ACEs scores, and that even having 1 ACEs score is it's an awful thing to experience, and of course is going to have impacts on later outcomes. So this is just a graphic that's kind of breaking down for us more about these adverse childhood experiences. I like this slide because it just kind of shows different aspects in terms of, that intergenerational piece, right? So we're starting to, in going and thinking about a child really holistically, we're thinking about, we can even go back to genetics, right? We can go back to the prenatal environment. We're looking at, all of these social factors that are impacting that development, right from the very beginning. And then, of course, having epigenetics, having mothers who are enduring toxic stress during their pregnancies. And then we have the community factors that are going to be coming into play as the children are growing up. Do they have low socioeconomic status? Do they have dangerous neighborhoods that they're living in? Do they feel supported in their neighborhoods or at school? Are there caregivers outside of their home that they feel that they can trust and can help them, or they can just talk to? So then finally, on the flip side, we can start to talk about some resiliency building experiences and positive community environments. So the good news is that as we're learning more and more about these things, we're also learning that there are a lot of ways that we can intervene. There are a lot of things we can change. There's a lot of things that we can do. And we've found a lot of resiliency building experiences for children. We have kind of on the left is a way to quantify this, right? So if we're screening for positive factors, once we've identified kids, then we can start drilling down into, okay, what are the resiliency factors they feel they have or don't have? And then we can start targeting those areas. So there's a lot listed here, but things like, do they feel loved by parents or a primary caregiver? Do they feel that they have friendships? Do they have somebody they can talk to, a relative, a friend, when they feel sad or worried? Do they have support from teachers or other members in the community? And that leads directly into community environments and how we can start to identify specific factors in the community as well. And we can start to intervene there as well in terms of, providing, clean, safe physical environments for kids. Making sure that if they have food insecurity, that we're addressing those issues as well. because these are whole humans, and every aspect of the environment and their internal development is all coming together to influence those later lifetime outcomes.
I promise we will go back to the happiness. But if you have seen the ACEs, there is that initial one that came out, the 1 to 10, and then you may also see another one where they've added some items. And so some of the items that they have added on that second one address like sexual orientation. They have some different factors on there because, as we've already kind of mentioned, minority populations disproportionately higher prevalence of these ACEs scores. And so when we talk about, we break it down even further and we go beyond ethnicity and we start to look at that intersectionality of sexual minority individuals, well, then we even have even more adverse ACEs that are going to be happening. And so there was a study that was done by Rothman and colleagues, and I know more research, but this is what I'm promising you that it's evidence-based in saying this. But what they said is hey, we took a survey of 140,000 sexual minority individuals, and collectively what we found is that these experiences of childhood sexual abuse, of childhood physical abuse, of emotional maltreatment within this population was a lot higher. And so for sexual minority women, 76%, they were the highest of all of the groups in experiencing physical or sexual abuse. And so that just gives us an idea and says, hey, our students, our sexual minority students, they're even more at risk. And that may be something that we already are aware of or that we're already looking for, but this just goes to say, like, yes, this just confirms it. When we talk about the general population for sexual abuse, women, they were much lower. They were between 3% and 27%, and 0 to 16% for men. So that just kind of shows you just a little bit of comparison there. There's so much more. We're moving slowly through these because we love all of this. So I won't go further into that, but that just gives you an idea of some of those disparities happening between sexual minorities with ethnic minorities, between gender comparisons. So those are just all of the things that we'll want to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we also wanted to add in a little bit of an aspect of a case study, just because I think it's so helpful to just look at the story of an individual. So this is one reason why I wanted to provide a case study example. Another reason is because this particular case study is a 26-year-old female who's Caucasian. And so again, it automatically makes me think of, we have a difference between Caucasians and minority youths. And so when I saw this study that was really, high ACEs scores and a lot of outcomes, it automatically makes me think again, like we mentioned earlier, that this is really prevalent and it's going to be more severe in our minority populations. So this particular person is ACEs scores 8 out of 10, which is really high. And we showed outcomes in the realms of mental health, was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. In terms of physical health, had poor coping mechanisms, so smoking cigarettes, there's obesity, and then there's social, economic, and economic factors. So ultimately, this individual does not complete high school, so has low economic resources, and socially does not have good coping mechanisms either, and feels that, the relationships in adulthood are not only not satisfying, but they're actually pretty abusive. So these are some pretty heavy outcomes. And the interesting thing too about this individual is that there was never any intervention throughout grade school, middle school, high school. So here's this person that, you know, really seems to have like fallen through the cracks in a way. And so this just highlights, you know, when we're saying that this is a huge problem that we're facing, that we're missing kids, and there's so much opportunity for us to intervene. Like, you know, what would one intervention have done for this individual? So then, yeah, so this is just a nice graphic that I really liked, you know, talking about kind of the development of those factors coming into play. And so when we're thinking about that case study too, and thinking about, you know, how things progressed throughout the lifetime there. So this one is just showing, you know, as we've been talking about a lot, we're starting with generational embodiment, historical trauma, you know, coming in with those genetically intergenerational factors. Next, we're going to load on some social conditions and, you know, social environmental factors. Next, you know, we're going to add in some of those adverse experiences, which are going to in turn disrupt that neurodevelopment, and go to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. The adoption of, you know, health risk behaviors like we saw in the previous case study, which ultimately are leading to disease, disability, and other social problems. And unfortunately, early death. And this is a huge factor that I don't think we've touched on, which is that, you know, these higher ACEs scores, we're seeing shorter lifetimes up to 20 years.
And so just to kind of continue with this conversation and saying like, hey, these are pretty tremendous impacts that are for the lifespan, for your lifespan, for individuals that are impacted by ACEs. And so when we talk about what that looks like long term, we're going to start moving in that direction. Here are some of the impacts. And so we talk about traumatic brain injury, like PTSD, different mental health challenges, just flipping back and thinking about that case study for a second and saying, okay, an 8 out of 10 for that ACEs score. Okay, and that individual, you know, had mental health challenges, had some socioeconomic stuff. And so these are the things that we're going to start looking at if these things go unnoticed or untreated. And so we're going to continue talking about these outcomes, because this is the most important part, and just kind of underscoring like, hey, this is why there needs to be an intervention, because without intervention, what is going to happen, and this is all from the CDC and them coming out and saying, hey, as part of that Kaiser Permanente study, injury. And this one, when I looked at this one for injury, I was like, what do you mean? And I was thinking about that book, The Body Keeps the Score, and just thinking about the way that your body holds trauma. And I was like, duh, okay. But mental health, and just looking at maternal health, and we've talked about some of these different things, but they're pervasive and they're long lasting. However, there is good news.
Yeah, so in sort of a counter to addressing this problem with ACEs, there was a 7 experiences that were found to be considered positive childhood experiences. These were analyzed for psychometric soundness and published in JAMA Pediatrics. So these are questions that were asked to be responded to before the age of 18. And again, we have this yes or no to each one. I'll just go through these really quickly because we have so much to talk about, and I think we're running out of time. But yeah, so these PCEs, they have been determined to promote good mental health, resiliency, and success as adults. And they're simple things. We touched on a couple of these, but these are validated. So having support from friends, feeling belonging in school, participating in community traditions, feeling that there's one kind of adult family member that stood by you, that you're able to talk about your feelings with family, that you had at least 2 non-parent adults who took a genuine interest in you, and that you felt safe and protected by one parent in the home.
And so the good news with that too is that when we start to look at some of those things, if we can come in and intervene, what is wild about this to me is that even just looking at depressive disorders, if we can start to control for ACEs, we can reduce depression by 44%. Say what? But that's just an example of what this chart is showing right here. It's saying like, hey, if we can start to control for ACEs, that means that 2% of the population, obesity, okay, we're going to improve there. We're going to improve some risk and some health behaviors. And so that's kind of a hard conversation, right? Is because we've talked about some of these positive factors and some of these questions and things that we can control for. And we mentioned that, yeah, there's hope in this. And so the hope in this is that we started to talk about those questions. We have these protective factors for some of our students. And so we have like the protective factors are just any kind of attributes of the family, the community, the larger society that are helping the individual to thrive and to overcome. And I apologize if I'm going through these just a little bit faster, but I want to make sure because they're important. So some of the protective factors, we talked about them in the questionnaire, but as individuals, as educators, we taught, SEL curriculum, like what we're doing in the classroom, talking about mental health, talking about treatment, just some of those things. And these are just some of the things that, hey, okay, social emotional competence, when we talk about SEL lessons, when we talk about having concrete support for those students in times of crisis and times of need, when we're talking about having supportive social connections, those group components, having, group counseling, group therapy, things like that. And we'll talk more about strategies in just a minute. But these are why we do some of those things as educators and why we institute them is because they are so important. And for us, we're looking at this in the context of saying, hey, protective factors, we're helping to alleviate and to manage trauma. Resiliency is definitely part of this, and preventing and talking about resiliency. They came up with 6 strategies, and this is again from the CDC, and saying like, hey, if we can just strengthen the economic support. And some of these I totally recognize they're things that they're higher above, they're way above my pay grade. But and just saying, hey, these are some of the things that we could be aware of, talking about policy or different things, and saying, hey, strengthening economic supports, or hey, if we can protect against, promote strategies to help against violence, if we can start a strong start. And we talk about different ways with the early intervention with children as they're starting out in the schools. If we can do a strong start there, if we can help individuals, if we can help families like manage some of these difficult environmental factors and help them foster and prevent some of these experiences. For us in the classroom, thinking about the demographic, thinking about the age that we're working with, these are some of the things that as we engage and we go into the classroom that we can say, hey, okay, what does my curriculum look like? Okay, what does my support look like? Okay, can I help this family manage any of the challenges that they're contending with? Can I be a supportive adult in this child, in this individual's life? And when we think about that minority component of things, it says, hey, the research, Zhang and Manat said, and I hope I didn't butcher that name, but they, in their experiment, their research, they came out and they said, hey, this is what we came to the conclusion. Our findings are that we need to tailor our interventions so that these strategies are accompanied and they're inclusive for our minority youth. And so part of that is saying, hey, first, before we can do that, we need to understand trauma. And so that has been the big premise for us today, is saying, hey, this is trauma. This is the conversation that we need to be having, because part of it and what one of our goals is to spread awareness around this. And we talk about it, and you may already recognize that it's really important, but that is going to be a primer in being able to help these students overcome some of these challenges that they're contending with. So one of the things that we talked about, trauma-informed schools. And so trauma-informed schools, as educators, as professionals, this is like one of the things that we just looked at and was like, oh, well, duh. If a student has a safe environment to walk into, then they're going to be better off. Then it's going to help alleviate some of those challenges that they're associating with, that they have at home, that they're contending with. And these are different strategies. And I wish we had more time. This presentation probably be like 14 different in itself and even more than that. But these are just some of the strategies, and we had some really awesome resources too. But this is what they were just talking about and saying, like, hey, this is what a trauma-informed school looks like. This is the framework for it. If in my classroom, if I want to be more trauma-informed, if I'm going to help my students, if I'm going to help, I need to be able to understand what trauma is. I need to know what it looks like. I need to be able to intervene. Having an awareness, some of those statistics, then I can be more informed about who and what that might look like. Talking about the case study gives a face to a name and saying, like, hey, okay, this is what this student looks like. It's not just a statistic. And so this is some of the things, and talking about identification and assessment. What do those policies look like for school? What does that screening look like? How are we contending with that? Are we doing trauma-informed practices? Is there a disparity in those referrals for marginalized youth, for our racial and ethnic minority youth? What does that look like? Prevention and identification, what is that? Do we have teachers? Do we have parents? Is everybody on board in order to help with these strategies? And just bringing awareness, the trauma education and awareness, that's what we're doing today, is we're engaging in this conversation and we're saying, hey, this is really important. And we're saying, hey, what are the things that we can do and how can we recognize and continue this conversation? Partnerships with students and families are going to be super important. Learning strength and learning how to trust and accept, that's a big one. Creating trauma-informed learning environments where our students feel safe to come into the classroom, where they feel safe to engage with us. Having that cultural responsiveness to make sure that we are appropriate in our response to our students and how we are engaging with them. And also having clear and well-communicated procedures for crisis response and what that looks like. For our students and for our staff, that is also saying, hey, are you okay? And sometimes I think the pandemic helped shed light on this, but sometimes our faculty is overlooked and just saying, like, hey, you're a part of this, and how are you handling the trauma, and how are you handling the stress, and what do you need? And making sure that we're inclusive of those practices as well, and looking and helping our own backyard. And these disciplinary policies, and I kind of mentioned this already, it's just looking at some of those disparities and are they inclusive? And a lot of the research will say that the referrals and some of the disciplinary rates are disproportionate for our minority youth. And so why is that? What are we doing? What does that analysis look like? And just being able to collaborate across systems. And so this is just another one real quick. This is one I like to say is a happy ending, because when we talk about ACEs, sometimes this has been heavy, right? Some of it, and just talking about, like, hey, sexual trauma, hey, trauma in the home, and talking about, like, a student is witnessing abuse, and you have a family member that's incarcerated. So what also can happen is that these preventive strategies that we've talked about, and some of those positive strategies, some of those positive environmental strategies, they do work. And so this one, I like, this one is actually mine. And so my ACEs score was an 8 out of 10. And just some of those childhood trauma, and those protective strategies for myself in my own life. And I think that's why I feel so passionately about this, is because of the experiences that I had. And so often I tell Alesha, I'm all, man, I shouldn't be here. Like, I should not be in this program. I shouldn't be a doctoral student. Like, I shouldn't. And so I think that's why this is important for both of us too, is just saying, like, hey, yeah, if you can just be the person. It just takes one person to take an active role in a student's life to really change the trajectory. And I think that is, like, the big thing for us, and just saying, like, hey, if we take nothing, it's just like, hey, how can we be more present for our students?
Yeah, I think this is such a big subject, and there's so many aspects. And when I look at everything, it feels like you're watching a car wreck in slow motion. But we have all of this information, and we have all of these ways that we can start coming in and just snapping on a seatbelt.
And we know this is a Friday, and you could be anywhere, and you chose to be with us. So we just want to thank you for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Alyson and Alesha, for an amazing presentation. Yes, one virtual round of applause for our presenters today. We have about 5 minutes till the end of the hour, so I will open up the rest of the hour for the Q&A session. Please feel free to drop your comments or your questions in the chat, or if you're feeling brave, please unmute and ask.
We don't mind that either, because it means it's the weekend.
I had a question. First, I just really appreciated all your work on this, and I really, yeah, just thank you for talking about this. And in regards to like the ACEs inventory, the item that asked if you had witnessed basically like domestic violence where the mother was victimized, would I be correct in assuming that like that could be applied to any other caregiver in the home or even like an older sibling, or is it specific to the mother?
That's a great question. In terms of how the research has been done at this point, it is specifically based on the mother, because the mother tends to be, the strongest caregiver. I think it's a really valid question, though. I think it's something that we should definitely look into more, because it seems, pretty obvious that it probably would also have an impact. I think the only way that that's really currently being addressed is more in terms of, you know, um, neighborhood, environment, violence in that sort of sense, at that level, which is a contributing factor for sure. It's definitely an ACEs. We didn't really get to touch on it too much, but there are expanded versions of ACEs since the initial 10-item study that address some of those environmental factors a little bit more. But yeah, that's a really great question, and I think an area that we should definitely look at.
Yeah, thank you. I'll have to look into that more. It just came to mind because, not all people have like a mother in the home as a caregiver.
And I should say that some of the expanded versions do also include primary caregiver. So I think that's really what, that item is trying to get at, is like is your primary caregiver experiencing physical abuse that the child's witnessing. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Awesome. We appreciate you all.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
All right, well, if we don't have any other last minute questions, we'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Again, one last virtual round of applause for Alyson and Alesha, our presenters today, for a extremely informative and interactive presentation today. This presentation is recorded and will be uploaded to the UTTEC Lab website, which you can access by going to u-tteclab.com. Again, thank you again, everybody, so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon. And I hope you all have a great day.